One more very exciting game from the Tata Steel Chess India Rapid event. As we know already by now that Magnus Carlsen very convincingly managed to win this event. But so many spectacular games were in fact played in this tournament. So I would like to show you one more game played by Magnus Carlsen in round 1 against Praggnanadhaa. And interestingly, we just find out afterwards, of course, but it's number 1 against number 2 playing in round 1 against each other. So that is very, very interesting to have a look at. And maybe things would have gone completely differently. Well, let's find out in this video what actually happened in that game. And if you do like my videos from this event, make sure to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like. You can support the channel also by making a PayPal donation. So I really appreciate all your support, and I'm here to share my enthusiasm for the game by showing some very interesting things which were happening on the board. So Magnus Carlsen is playing with the white pieces, starts the game with 1 c4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, g3. So Magnus is aiming for some sort of Catalan setup. d5, bishop g2. And of course we do get the main lines of the Catalan when white gets the chance once again to play the move d4 and occupy the center with his pawns. But one of the modern main lines here, black can stop that by playing the move d4 here himself. So grabbing space in the center, making it harder for that knight on b1 to join play. d3, very solid developing move, and bishop to b4. It's very interesting check actually, because white got to make a decision on how to block that check, either with a knight. Well, if you do play knight d2, then the bishop on c1 cannot move. If you do play bishop d2, which is what Magnus played, then Pragg continues here with the move a5. I think it's a very interesting move, as basically you're saying that you want to maintain control over the b4 square, and you're ready to recapture anytime soon with a pawn. White castled, knight c6, and of course white does have a lot of options. You can move the bishop somewhere, you can move the knight via a3 to c2, or maybe even to b5. I mean, the big question is in general, how is white going to complete his development? And exchanging minor pieces is generally speaking quite a good thing to do for white. But Magnus decided here to take on b4. Bishop takes b4, and now a takes b4. I think it's very important to recapture in this way, because without moving the piece, the rook on a8 is now pretty active, as it puts quite some pressure down the a file, making it harder for white to complete development. White played the move a3, black castles, and you see that pawn takes b4 is not possible because the rook on a1 is unprotected. So if white wants to do something, he should develop the knight from b1 to d2, which was what happened in the game. But now this is exactly the moment you do take with the pawn on a3, because white is no longer able to recapture with a piece. I mean, he can actually take back with a rook, but after swapping this pair of rooks, you end up with quite a weak pawn on the half open file. White can probably get some problems with that pawn, as black has ideas to put a queen on e7, get a bishop out, bring the rook over to a8. I do definitely prefer black here a bit. So instead of taking with the rook, Magnus played here the move queen to b3. And now the roles are reversed, as if black does move the pawn, then the rook on a8 is actually hanging. So white is planning to take back with the rook on a3, and after exchanging rooks he can recapture with the queen. However, now rook a6 is played. Very good move. Praggnanadhaa is showing some very good understanding here, as after taking with the rook on a3, he develops the rook via the 6th rank, rook b6. It's a nice square. Of course, you do attack the queen on b3. The queen has to move again. And, well, black played queen e7. So why do I like this play from black's perspective? Well, white is not able to develop its thematical queenside play by expanding on the queenside with b2, b4. This square has been fantastically controlled by black's pieces. Of course, white can use the open a file, so he doubles on the a file. But what is it going to accomplish for white? e5 played. Black is occupying the center and prepares the development of the bishop somewhere on this diagonal. Rook a8. sort of pinning the bishop, but still you can move the bishop whenever you want. Bishop f5 is a reasonable move, but before doing that, h6 was played. It's also absolutely fine. I think one of the ideas is that white is not able to play this thematical maneuver of knight g5, knight e4, attempting to initiate the exchange of minor pieces. So white has to come up with some sort of other plan, and Magnus played here knight e1. The knight does look pretty passive, but on the other hand, the diagonal for the bishop has been opened. And very soon we will see that the knight is able to become more active, hopefully. Black played g6. I mean, this is not forced at all, but it's quite a playable move, like you're preparing to go king g7 at some point. b3 was played, bishop to g4, attacking the pawn, but do you really attack it? Magnus played a3, very interesting moment. If you do take on e2, there is knight e4, and the queen hits the bishop. You can exchange the knight still, but after that, the bishop is running short on squares. If it goes to h5, there is g4, and the bishop is trapped. So no time to take the pawn on e2. The bishop has to go somewhere else. Bishop e6 was played. And now queen c1. What is the idea of this move? Of course, you do keep an eye on this pawn on h6. It's still not under attack, but king g7 was played anyway. And now the knight comes to c2. So finally we do understand what Magnus is playing for. Black swings over with the knight from f6 to d7. The knight is on its way to c5. I really like this maneuver. The rooks can be exchanged, which is what happened. Black takes back with the queen, and now I think we do see one of the critical moments in the game. As how is white going to proceed? I think that is the big question at this point. A very safe way of playing here is to go for queen a3 and offer the exchange of queens. If that happens, let's say queens are exchanged, you can put a knight on b4. I mean, things can be exchanged, and I really don't see how are you going to make progress here as white, as black is going to put a knight on c5 with pressure against the pawn on b3, and well, black is absolutely comfortable here. Magnus is playing very ambitiously, but objectively his position is not really demanding that from him. He played here this move, f4. Very interesting. To be honest, it really caught me by surprise. I understand this sort of move is always an option, but just looking at the position, it seems to me that white's pieces are placed at the other side of the board, so I didn't expect a pawn break on the king side. What is the idea? If you do take on f4, Magnus, I'm pretty sure he wanted to follow it up with a move queen to b2, so that you do hit the pawn on d4. You're eyeing the king on that long diagonal, and things are just really tricky. I mean, it's still super complicated, but if you manage to win that pawn on d4, white is getting quite some piece activity. So it's very understandable that Praggnanadhaa didn't really want to go for that line, and instead he went for a really nice move. Knight to b4 may come as a surprise to you as well, but it does make sense to clarify the situation. Your queen is becoming active again after the exchange of knights, and you never have to reckon with the bishop trading itself on c6. Not that it's often a problem, but here in this case black maintains pretty nice control over the center, as the knight on d7 supports the pawn on e5. Like taking on e5 it's not very attractive. I think black is in good shape in that case. If you try to hit the pawn on d4 one way or another, black can always consider playing the move c5 now. So that's one of the ideas actually of moving the knight away from c6 with knight b4, that you can always use your c pawn again. Let's see what happens after the exchange of knights. Instead of taking on e5, white played knight f3, increasing the pressure against these pawns on e5 and d4, but the knight comes now to c5, and there's no time to take the pawn on e5. It runs into knight takes b3, and you do lose the rook on a1. So white played instead now queen a3 anyway, and it feels like things have gone wrong for white. After the exchange of queens, it's time to take on f4. White takes back, and it's knight takes b3. Black is up. a very healthy pawn. And, well, also the pawn on d4, it is well defended by the knight. So how is white going to generate some counterplay here? Well, first he puts the king on f2. So the pawn on e2 is still defended. King f6, activating the king. And maybe at some point you would love to go g5 and trade off this pawn so that, well, you do have the chance to mobilize pawns on the king side. White therefore played h4 to cover this square, and now the bishop is no longer needed to keep that pawn defended on h3. Black goes for the move c6, taking away potential pressure on this long diagonal for the white bishop on g2. Rook a8, but now it's rook a6. And this is finally has been made possible because the rook on a3 was keeping an eye on that knight on b3. White doesn't want to exchange rooks because this a pawn is very difficult to stop. I think black is completely winning here. So rook b8 was played, attacking the pawn on b7. But now the rook comes to a2. And this is a very important moment again, because how are you going to play here? I mean, the pawn on b7 can be taken. If you take on b7 with the rook, there is knight c5 with a double attack, attacking the rook, attacking the pawn on d3. If rook goes away, it's knight takes d3, exploiting the pin on this second rank. You can't take with the e pawn. If the king goes to the back rank, you just run into mating patterns here with rook and knight. While in case you move your king to g3, well, there's rook takes e2, and this endgame is just really, really bad. I mean, probably black is just winning here. So taking the pawn on b7 is not very attractive. Now, the question is how to anticipate potential threats against the pawn on e2 with knight c1. Attacking pawn on e2, but also the pawn on d3. Knight c5 is an idea, as we have seen. So it's either the move bishop f1, anticipating prophylactical move, or the move king e1. Well, king e1 was played in the game, but this is an absolute massive moment already in round 1 of this Tata Steel India Rapid event. Because here, Praggnanadhaa missed a big golden opportunity. He dropped back with the rook to a7. He didn't want to give up the pawn on b7. However, instead, if you do play king f5, you are super active, but it does require a lot of calculation. Let's try to understand the following lines, because you have to see this rook takes b7, attacking the knight. The knight can come back to c5 to hit the rook. If the rook goes away, you can take on f4. Everything is fine. But look, there is knight takes d4 with check, but there is king takes f4. Absolutely amazing line, and the king is on its way to e3, but there is knight takes e6 with another check. And I'm pretty sure that both players have seen this exact position in their calculation. And the problem is that if you do take on e6 one way or another, either with the f pawn or the knight, let's say you do take with a knight, there's rook takes f7 with another check, king e3, threatening checkmate, can still be met by rook f3, and white is doing very well in this rook endgame. However, instead of taking with the knight or with the pawn, remember white has just captured a piece on e6. There's this insane idea to play the move king e3 anyway. Now the knight on c5 cannot be taken. It leads to checkmate thanks to the help of the king. So don't do that. But if you play something else, if you try to run away with your king, then this knight on c5 is still able to take the rook on b7, and black is up the exchange and will win the game. The relative best move here for white in this case is to drop back with the rook to b1. There's knight takes e6, and this endgame is just really, really bad. I mean, there are ideas to take on e2, to get a knight to d4 on f4. Black is going to win one pawn after another, and this is absolutely winning for black. As I said, it was not played by Praggnanadhaa. You see, this is why rapid chess is also difficult. I mean, you can rely on intuition, but you do lack the time to calculate very precisely. So instead, rook a7 was played. Black keeps the pawn defended. There followed king f2. The rook went back to a2, and this is actually quite interesting, as I think at this point Magnus realized He should not go for king e1 because of king f5. And we have the same winning line as we have checked before. And therefore, at this moment, he played the move bishop f1. And that is the right way of defending this position. Now, the king is much safer, and the pawn on b7 is threatened to be taken. It's still very complicated. If you go back with a knight to c5, then also the pawn on d4 becomes more vulnerable. If you play rook a7, which was played in the game, there is bishop g2 and rook a2. And, well, the players agree to a draw. Understandably, Praggnanadhaa is very satisfied with a very comfortable draw with the black pieces against Magnus Carlsen. But he still could have considered playing on at this point. Instead of rook a7, knight c1 is the most ambitious move. Probably, if we do follow a line like rook takes b7, well, there's knight takes d3. Well, this line is in fact very dangerous because the pawn is pinned. If you go king g3, it's knight c5 with a check coming in. Like, you hit the rook on b7. If the rook goes away, you put a knight on e4, forcing the king to go to the second rank, and then it's d3. Black is breaking through, once again exploiting a pin along the second rank. Therefore, instead of taking the pawn on b7, if knight c1 would have been played, white is recommended here to go king e1. So that there's no threat. I mean, the pawns on d3 and e2, they're well covered. King f5 is the way to keep the game going, and the pawn on f4 is pretty loose after king d1. Knight goes back to b3, rook takes b7, knight goes back to c5 to hit the rook again. But, well, this is incredibly sharp. If you do take the pawn on d4 with check, you may consider taking on f4. King g4 is apparently better, and black is apparently a bit better, but we never know what would have happened in fact. I mean, you're ready to take this pawn on h4 and run with your h-pawn, and rook a1 is another idea to pick up the bishop. Super complicated. It's understandable that the players agreed to a draw, but this was a very narrow escape for Magnus Carlsen in round 1. And if Prag would have found this amazing resource with king f5, then he may have won the game, and, well, then it would have been a different tournament. We never know what would have happened. Thanks for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. See you soon again.